A starving widow fed a frozen stranger her only loaf. He owned the land beneath her. The bread was the color of pine bark and weighed about the same. I remember that. I remember holding it in both hands in her doorway while the snow came sideways behind me, and the warmth from inside hit my face like a slap after 3 days of nothing but cold. She'd handed it to me without a word, just held it out through the half-open door, and I took it because I was too far gone to do anything else. I didn't know her name yet. She stood there barefoot on the threshold with her dress pulled tight at the collar and her jaw set like she was bracing for something. Her eyes were dark and steady. Not afraid of me, which was the first thing I noticed, because most people in those hills went pale when I came to the door looking the way I was looking. I was not a man that read like good news in the November of 1887. Lean as a post rail, frost thick in my beard, blood on my coat sleeve from where I'd come down wrong off a ledge 2 days back, and I had the look of a man who had been talking to no one for a very long time, which was accurate. She handed me the bread. That was all. No name, no question, no where are you headed. She just handed it over like it was something she'd already decided, the way you decide things before the moment comes so you don't have to decide them in front of someone. And then she stood there in the doorway waiting for me to go. I should say this plainly. That bread was all she had. I didn't know that when I took it. I found out later. I think about it sometimes still. The way a person can give away the last thing they have left and not make any noise about it, not arrange their face to show the weight of the sacrifice, just hold the thing out and let it be what it is. I ate half of it standing at the edge of her porch in the blowing snow with my back to her because I was ashamed of how fast I was eating. When I turned around, she'd gone inside and shut the door. That was how I met Nora Calder. In the years after Claire died, the house had gotten quieter by degrees, the way a room gets colder when you let the fire go down, not all at once, not dramatically, just a slow settling into a kind of cold you stop noticing because it becomes the normal temperature of things. I had friends in town, or people I'd known long enough to call friends, but I didn't go in much. I had the work. I had Dade and Fosco and the hands through the working seasons, and then the long winters with just the 3 of us. A man can live like that for a long time. I would have kept on. That is maybe the strangest part of it, looking back, not that I was suffering, but that I had made a version of things work that was not the right version, and I didn't know it was the wrong version because I'd never had anything to compare it to anymore. Claire had been gone long enough that I'd stopped being able to remember the shape of the difference clearly. I knew there was a difference. I had stopped knowing what it felt like. Then a November storm and a lame horse and a stranger's doorway. My name is Ellis Hart, and I've owned most of Bone Creek Valley since I was 32 years old. 12,000 acres, give or take, running east from the ridge down through the bottomland where the creek bends twice and the grass comes up thick in spring. I came into it by purchase, not inheritance, bought it parcel by parcel over about 8 years, cash money, from men who wanted out and families who'd given up on it. I was not soft about the terms. I paid fair, not generous, and I kept my books clean and my word cleaner, and by the time I was 40 I had more land than I could ride in a single day and less company than a fence post. My wife Claire died in the spring of 1883. Fever. She had it 3 days, and on the 4th day she was gone. We had no children. We had the house and the land and a life that was quiet and full at the same time, and I had thought for years that was enough, really believed it. And then she was gone and the quiet turned into something else entirely. Something with weight and edges. Something that followed me from room to room in the evenings when I came in from the work, and there was nothing to come into. I kept going. That is what I know how to do. I kept the hands on through the summer, ran the cattle, made the bank payments in Durango on time every month, repaired the north fence line after the elk came through in October. I did everything that needed doing. But the house got smaller every year, and by 1886 I had started riding out longer 2 nights, 3 nights at a stretch on the far end of the property, sleeping rough in the open, coming back filthy and silent. The hands stopped trying to make conversation with me after a while. They did their work, I did mine, and we gave each other room, which suited everyone. My foreman Dade was a solid man who understood that some things don't get discussed. Fosco, the old Ute man who'd worked my operation for 7 years, understood the same thing in the same way, and then some. Between them, they kept everything running with minimal interference from me, which I appreciated more than I ever said. Men who do their work without needing to be managed are a kind of mercy. The winter of 1887 came hard and early. Snow in October, which wasn't unusual up on the ridge, but then it didn't let up the way it usually did in November. By the second week of November, we had 2 feet on the ground, and the temperature was running below what my thermometer could measure reliably. I sent most of the hands back to Durango for the season, kept Dade and Fosco, brought the herd down to the lower pasture, banked the hay stacks against what was coming. I went out to check the south fence line on a Tuesday morning in the middle of November. I should have sent Dade. I knew I should. But I was restless that morning in the particular way that comes on me sometimes, a tight, close-in feeling that makes the walls of a room press in, and the only relief is to be moving, to have ground going under you and distance opening up. So I saddled my gray gelding cutter and rode out. The fence was fine. The weather wasn't. A front moved in while I was 3 miles out, and the temperature dropped so fast and hard it felt like a hand pressing down on the top of your skull. Cutter came up lame on the way back, stone bruise in the near foreleg. He started favoring it bad and pulling his foot up with every step, and by the time I'd gotten him unsaddled and tied in the lee of a spruce thicket, I was already past the point where walking back to the main house made clean sense. 2 miles in weather like that, without shelter, without the light. It was the kind of calculation that could go wrong fast. I was on the north end of my own property, which is a strange thing to say out loud. I'd ridden every inch of it at some point, or thought I had. But up in the timber where the land tilts toward the ridge it gets complicated. There were old homestead claims up there from the early settling days. Some reverted to territory land over the years. Some I'd bought out, and standing in the blowing snow and the gathering dark, I was not entirely certain which parcel I was on. I found the cabin about an hour before the light went entirely. Small place, the kind that takes a while to look like anywhere, and then you realize it's the only place that will do. Log walls with the chinking starting to go in spots, shakes on the roof, a stone chimney with smoke coming out of it thin and pale, a fire that was barely holding, a garden plot on the south side buried under snow, the post-end wire fence sticking up through the drifts at odd angles, a lean-to shed with the door hanging open and nothing inside it. No horse, no cow, no sign of a man anywhere. The woodpile at the east wall was low enough that I could count the pieces from 50 yards off. I knocked. She opened the door, and I've told you about the bread. What I haven't told you is the rest of what I saw. Inside that cabin was cold enough that I could see my breath standing in the doorway. A fire going, the small struggling one I'd seen from outside, and a horse blanket hung over the window to trap what warmth there was, and a pot on the stove that smelled like boiled water and nothing else. She was wearing 2 dresses, one on top of the other, a man's wool coat worn as a shawl over the whole arrangement. Her feet wrapped in cloth strips wound around and tied at the ankle. Not boots, cloth. She was younger than I'd expected. I'd pictured someone older, a woman alone up here in November. I'd assumed 50 at least. She wasn't more than 30, maybe 28. Dark hair pulled back from a face that was sharp at the cheekbones from the cold and from not eating enough, which turned out to be both. She looked at me with steady dark eyes, and she did not look frightened. Wary, yes, measuring me carefully, but not frightened, which told me something. I told her I was caught out in the storm, that I had a lame horse tied in the spruce trees a mile east and needed somewhere to wait out the night. I didn't give my name. She looked at me for a long, silent count, and then she handed me the bread and stepped back from the door. She didn't say much that first evening. I sat near the stove and ate the rest of the bread, all of it, which I'm not proud of, and she sat across from me in the one chair the room contained and watched the fire. I asked about the wood situation. She said there was some. I offered to go get it. She said she could get her own wood. I let it be. Around 9 o'clock, with the wind doing something long and low against the north wall of the cabin, she told me about Warren. His name was Warren Calder. He'd worked a placer claim on the east slope of the ridge through the summer and had gone in the river in August trying to cross when the water was high. She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed until the surface of it is smooth. Not because the grief is done, just because you've gotten it to where it doesn't ambush you mid-sentence. She missed him. That was clear without being said. But she was still here, still upright, still taking each day as a thing to get through and do right by, which told me something about the kind of woman she was. She said she'd kept the cabin because the claim was still active and she hadn't known what else to do. The snow had come before she'd gotten enough laid in. She'd had some bad luck with the food stores. Bad luck with the food stores. 3 words doing the work of a whole winter's hard education. I said I was sorry about her husband. She nodded once and looked back at the fire. I slept on her floor near the stove. She gave me a blanket without being asked. In the morning the storm had moved off east and left a foot of fresh snow over what was already there, and I went out and found Cutter right where I'd left him, cold and unhappy but not frozen, the stone bruised no worse. I walked him back to the cabin slow, tied him in the lean-to, and went inside. I told Nora Calder I needed to make a trip back to my house before I could bring her wood and food. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "What house?" I told her, "Here is the thing about owning land. You stop seeing it after a while. It becomes numbers on a page. Square footage, fence lines, creek drainage, carrying capacity in a dry year. You ride across it, and what registers is the ledger entry, not the ground itself, not the particular way the light sits on a hillside in late afternoon, not the smell of the spruce timber after a rain, not the sound the creek makes under the ice in February. All of that goes invisible when the land is a financial fact rather than a place where people live and try to make something. I had owned 12,000 acres of this valley for 15 years, and somewhere in those years I had stopped noticing what was on it. The families that had sold out and moved on, the claims that had reverted, the homestead parcels I'd bought in a job lot from a land agent in Durango in 1885, without writing most of them out to see what I was getting. The Calder claim was one of those. One parcel in a group of 11 that I'd bought off a departing settler who'd consolidated them from various holders over the years. I had a deed for it in my office drawer. I had never set foot on the ground. Warren Calder had held a year-to-year lease arrangement with the previous owner of record, a standard grazing and improvement lease of the kind common up on the ridge. When I bought the parcel in 1885, the lease came with it as part of the transaction. When Warren died in August of 1887, the lease became technically the estate's, which in this case meant nobody's, because there was no estate and no executor, just a widow alone on the ridge who didn't know the name of the man who now owned the land under her feet. My land agent in Durango, a careful man named Reese who had handled my affairs for 12 years, would have sent a lease renewal notice to the cabin address in September. No response. He would have sent a follow-up notice in October. No response. At that point, per the terms of the standard lease, it lapsed automatically. The parcel reverted to me free and clear of any encumbrance. Reese would have made a note in the ledger and moved on to the next item. Which meant that Nora Calder had been living on my land, in a cabin that was legally mine, since the end of October. And I was the man standing in her kitchen who had just eaten her last piece of bread. I sat on Cutter in the snow outside her door and tried to find the right way to say this. There was no right way. There was only the straight way, and the straight way was going to land hard. She came to the door when she heard me out there, just standing in the cold. I said, I own this parcel. Her face went very still, the way a person's face goes still when they're running a calculation they don't want to run. She looked at the snow between us for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, how long have you known? I said, since about 5 minutes ago. She looked at me a long time after that. I had expected fear or tears or the sudden crumpling that comes when a hard thing lands on a person unprepared. What I got was none of those. It was the look of someone who has been knocked down before and knows that the first thing you do when you get back to your feet is assess the situation clearly before you do anything else. She said, so what do you intend to do? Not what does this mean for me, not where will I go, what do you intend to do? I said, right now I intend to ride back to my house and come back with food and wood. We can talk about everything else after. She said, I don't want your charity. I said, you fed me last night when you had nothing. I'm settling the account. She looked at me, then she turned and went inside. I was gone 3 hours. I came back with 2 pack horses loaded with split wood, more than she could burn through before spring, and a crate of provisions, salt pork, dried beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee, a tin of lard, 4 tins of peaches I'd had on a shelf since the fall. Dade helped me load without asking a single question. Fosco watched from the barn door with his hat on and said nothing. Both of them understood what they were looking at, I suspect, before I did. She came out when she heard the horses, looked at the packs, looked at me. She said, that's a great deal. I said, it's a hard winter. She didn't thank me. She started unloading. We worked side by side without talking for about an hour, me stacking wood at the east wall while she carried things inside and found places for them. When everything was in, I looked the cabin over properly. The roof had a soft spot on the south end that needed attention before the next heavy snow or the shakes would let go entirely. The east window had lost its seal almost entirely, cold coming straight through around the frame. The stovepipe had a crack in the second joint that was going to start backing smoke into the room once it opened a little further. I told her what I saw. She listened without arguing with any of it. She'd already seen it herself, I could tell, had been lying awake thinking about it probably. I said I'd come back in 2 days with what I needed to make the repairs. She said, and then you'll tell me to leave. I said I wasn't planning on it. She said, what are you planning? I told her honestly that I didn't know exactly, that I hadn't thought past getting her warm and fed. That was the truth. She looked at me the way she looked at things she needed to decide about, not hostile, just thorough, taking her time. Then she said, all right, come back in 2 days. I rode back down the ridge in the early dark with the snow starting up again, and I thought about her the whole way. The bread, the 2 dresses and the cloth-wrapped feet and the pot of boiling water. The way she'd said, I don't want your charity with her jaw, said exactly the same way it had been in the doorway when she handed me the bread, like she'd decided who she was going to be in this situation and intended to hold the line. I had been running land for 20 years and had met people of every kind, hard ones and soft ones, honest and dishonest, people who folded under pressure, and people who went quiet and tighter and held on. I had not often met someone who came at a hard thing the way she had. What do you intend to do? Not stating what she needed, not asking for anything for herself, just asking what I was going to do and waiting to see if the answer was worth anything. I thought about that the whole ride home, and I was still thinking about it when I unsaddled Cutter and went inside. I came back in 2 days, then 2 days after that. By the 3rd week of November, I was making the ride up the ridge every other day, and both Dade and Fosco had long since noticed, and neither of them said a single word about it, and I appreciated that as much as I'd always appreciated anything about either of them. I fixed the roof, took most of one cold morning, pulling the bad shakes and nailing down new ones, but it came out solid. I resealed the east window with caulk and a strip of oilcloth I'd brought up. The stovepipe joint I replaced entirely with a new length of pipe fitted and set right. She watched me work from the ground when I was up on the roof, and from across the room when I was at the stovepipe, and she did not hover or offer unnecessary commentary, which was its own form of respect. I found a pair of women's boots in a trunk at the house. They'd belonged to a woman who'd worked for Claire in the last year before she died, left behind when she'd gone. I brought them up wrapped in cloth and set them on Nora's table without saying much about where they'd come from, just that I'd had them and thought they might fit. She looked at them for a moment. Her jaw was set the way it got when she was about to accept something that cost her something to accept. Then she put them on. I watched her lace them without appearing to watch her lace them. She stood and took a few steps on the board floor and didn't say anything, but the set of her jaw changed. Something went out of it. She was proud. That needs to be said plainly because there is nothing small about pride like hers. It wasn't vanity. There wasn't a vain thing about her. It was the pride of someone who has built everything they have through hard work and doesn't want to owe debts they can't see the bottom of. I understood it from the inside. It was exactly what I had felt at 30, walking into the bank in Durango with 2 years of cowhand wages in my pocket and the loan officer looking at me like I'd come in off the wrong street. You learn to carry yourself straight when people don't expect you to stand at all. You learn not to ask for anything you can't account for. So I started leaving things without calling them gifts. Too much flour from the fall order, surplus, I said, nowhere to store it. Apple butter that came out too loose to sell. A wool blanket that nobody in the bunkhouse was using. A good cast iron skillet that I told her I'd had 2 of. She accepted each of these without comment. She had to know I was lying about most of it. She let it go without making me admit it, which was its own kind of generosity. There was one afternoon in the last week of November when I found her outside the linta trying to split a piece of frozen pine with an axe that had a cracked handle wrapped in wire. The wood was green and wet at the core, and she'd been at it a while. I could see that from the mess of failed splits scattered around the block. I watched her from horseback for a moment before she heard me. She had the set to her that she got when she was working hard at something she intended to finish. Weight low, shoulders steady, the axe coming down with more technique than you'd expect. I got down and took the axe from her without asking. She let me have it, which told me she was more tired than she was showing. I split the pine. It wanted to be worked from the edge in, not center struck, and then worked through the rest of the pile while she stood back and watched. When I was done, she stacked it herself, piece by piece, without asking me to help. I let her. There was no good reason to take that from her. Afterward, we went inside and she made coffee. We sat at the table and she said, after a while, "You know you don't have to do all of it." I said, "I know that." She said, "I'm not helpless." I said, "I know you're not. I've never once thought you were." She looked at me. I said, "I like working, always have. Sitting still was never something I was much good at." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Claire must have had patience." I said she had a lot of things. Patience was one of them. Nora looked at her coffee cup. She said, "I'm sorry you lost her." I said, "Thank you." She nodded once, same way she always did when she'd said what she meant to say and didn't need to say more. I had come to know that nod. It wasn't dismissal. It was the mark of a person who understands that some things land clean and don't need to be helped along. We started talking more as the weeks went on. About the weather first, the way strangers do who are sharing a hard situation, and then about other things. The ridge and the land and the elk moving through in late November in numbers I hadn't seen in years. She knew the land better than I did in some ways, even though I'd owned it for 15 years. She'd spent 4 months watching it change, which south-facing slope stayed clear longest, where the water ran under the snow, where the deer came down in the late afternoon to feed. She'd paid close attention the way people do, when the land is everything they have to work with. She talked about Warren in small pieces over time, not in one long telling. A detail here, something he'd said, something he'd built or fixed or planned that she'd found half-finished when she went through his tools. He was a good man who worked hard and had terrible luck, she said once. She said it plainly, without self-pity, without the kind of performed grief that's looking for a particular response. She missed him. She was still grieving him. But she was also still here, still putting one foot in front of the next, because the alternative was not something she was going to consider. One evening toward the end of November, I told her about Claire. I don't know exactly how it happened. We were sitting at her table with coffee and the fire was going well, genuinely warm inside for what felt like the first time in a long while, and I started talking. I talked about how we'd met. Claire had come west from Missouri with her uncle's family, and I'd been hired to help with the move and spent a month working alongside her before I said anything. I talked about the years we'd had together, the ordinary good years, and about the spring of '83 and the 3 days and then the 4th. About coming in from the work in the evening to a house that was quiet in the wrong way, and how that sounds like something you could get used to, and how you never quite do. I talked more than I had talked to anyone in 4 years. Nora listened the way she did everything, without making a performance of it, without filling the pauses with sounds of sympathy, without leaning forward and arranging her face into the shape of concern. She was just present and still. When I was done, she waited a beat. Then she said, "You've been alone a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought so." Not that it would get better. Not that Claire would have wanted me to be happy or that time was a healer. Just, I thought so. Meaning she'd seen it herself and taken the measure of it, not just accepted my word for it. Said it plainly, like a fact she had verified independently. I am not a man who has needed much from people, or thought I needed much. I had managed 4 years alone in that house without falling apart, and I was reasonably proud of that, and I had told myself it was enough. But there is a difference between being left alone because you've asked for it and being seen clearly and then given room. That evening in November, I understood for the first time that I had been getting one, and had wanted the other for years without admitting it. The thing about those weeks in December was the routine of them. There is something that happens to a man when he has a place to be in the mornings, a direction, a reason for the ride that has nothing to do with checking fences or counting head or any of the ordinary business of running land. I had not had that in 4 years, and I had not noticed I was missing it until it came back. I would ride up in the gray early light with the cold so solid you could lean against it, Cutter's breath coming in plumes, the snow creaking under his feet, and there would be smoke at her chimney and lamplight in the gap of the curtain, and the knowledge that I was expected. Not in the way of an obligation, in the way of something that had been decided between 2 people without needing to be said out loud. She had coffee going by the time I got there most mornings. We would sit at the table in the early quiet and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and then I would go out and do whatever needed doing, checking the horses, hauling water from the spring I'd found for her on the north side of the cabin where it ran clear even in cold weather, splitting wood, checking the roof after a heavy snow to make sure the shakes were holding. And she would be inside doing whatever she was doing, the particular rhythms of her own work, and sometimes she'd come out to help with something and sometimes she wouldn't, and all of it felt natural and unforced and like something that had been true for longer than it had actually been. December came and the cold got serious. The kind of cold that stops being weather and becomes just the condition of the world, the permanent state of things, the year having converted entirely to the project of surviving until spring. I moved 2 horses up to Herlinta because it made practical sense for the east pasture work, and also because it meant I was up on the ridge most days. I stopped making excuses for being up on the ridge. The 15th of December brought a cold snap as bad as anything I'd seen up there in 15 years, and I stayed the night in the cabin, slept on the floor near the stove, same as the first time. In the morning she made coffee and we sat on either side of the table and she said, "You don't have to keep coming up here." I said, "I know that." She said, "I can manage. I want you to know that. I'm not going to fall apart if you stop coming." I said, "I know you can manage. I've never doubted that for a minute." She looked at me. I said, "I come up here because I want to, not for your benefit, for mine." Long quiet after that, the stove ticking as it settled, the wind running lower than it had been. She had both hands around her cup, eyes on them. She said, "I don't know what this is." I said, "I don't either." She said, "I don't want to owe you." I said, "You fed me bread when you had nothing at all left to feed anyone. Whatever accounting you're running, you don't owe me anything." She looked up from her cup and looked at me directly, and I held it. I am not a man who gives much away with his face. Claire had told me that early on, that you had to know me a long time before you got anything real back from me, that I gave nothing away. But I held Nora's eyes and I let her see what was in there. Not all of it, enough of it that there was no question about the direction. She held it too, a long, careful moment. Then she got up and went to the window and stood looking out at the snow. She said, "Warren used to say the worst thing about loneliness was that it made you bad at telling the real thing from just the wanting of it." I said, "That's true." She said, "How do you know the difference?" I sat with it for a moment. I said, "I thought you just did, eventually, if you were honest with yourself about it. If you sat still with the question long enough, and didn't talk yourself into anything before you were sure." She was quiet. I waited, which is something I have some practice at. She said, "I think I know the difference." I didn't answer that. I thought about Warren's saying for a long time afterward. Loneliness makes you bad at telling the real thing from just the wanting of it. He had known something true there. I had wanted things, warmth, company, being known by someone, badly enough for long enough that I'd had to get honest with myself about whether what I felt sitting at her table every other morning was real, or just the shape of the wanting filling itself in with whatever was nearby. I had sat with that question honestly through October and November, and the first 3 weeks of December, and the answer had kept coming back the same. I turned back to my coffee and let the morning come in around us, the thin pale light off the snow coming through the cloth she'd hung at the window, the stove ticking, the sound of the wind having dropped to something manageable outside. After a while she came back to the table and sat down, and we finished the coffee without saying more about it. It felt like enough, more than enough for one morning. Late December. I had been thinking about the land situation since November, the lapsed lease, the legal exposure she was living under without fully knowing it. I talked to Reese in Durango, laid it out for him, and he confirmed what I expected. The Calder lease had lapsed in October when no renewal response came in. The parcel was mine, free and clear of any claim. Reese also mentioned, with the kind of careful delicacy he brought to things that were legally simple but personally complicated, that if I wanted to formalize her situation on the property, there were 2 paths. A new lease, renewable annually on standard terms, or a title transfer, the parcel deeded over to her outright, no conditions, no ongoing arrangement, just hers. He'd named the second option in the way. He named things he thought were the right answer, but didn't want to appear to be pushing, said it, and then moved on quickly. I had thought about it for 3 weeks. Too soon, I told myself. She'll read it as a transaction, think I'm trying to purchase something, think the whole past 6 weeks has been a setup for a trade she didn't agree to. She'll hand it back, and whatever's been building between us will sour under the weight of it. But every time I came back up that ridge and sat at her table, I thought about the fact that she was on my land with no legal standing and didn't fully know it. That if I died tomorrow, or sold, or simply changed my mind, she'd be out in the cold with nothing in writing. She was trusting me with that. Maybe she knew the full extent of it and had decided to trust me anyway, which was worse, which meant the trust was running entirely one direction, and I hadn't done anything yet to make it mutual. Reese had asked me when we met to execute the deed transfer whether I was certain. It was the kind of question a careful man asks when he wants to be sure you've thought something through, not because he doubts you, but because it's his job to make sure the thing is decided. I told him I was certain. He nodded and passed me the pen. He said just before I signed, "She must be something." I said, "She is." He didn't say anything else about it. He was a man who knew when a question was already answered. I had always appreciated that in him. He did not need you to perform certainty. He just needed to see it once plainly. On the 28th of December, I rode up with the transfer document in my inside coat pocket, signed and witnessed by Reese and his assistant the afternoon before. She was in the linta when I got there, checking one of the horse's feet, holding the hoof up between her knees the way she'd taught herself to do, running her thumb along the edge of the shoe to check the set. She looked up when she heard me. I said, "I have something." I got down off Cutter and handed her the paper. She unfolded it and read it carefully, then read part of it again. I watched her face while she read. It stayed still and even. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, not crying or not yet, just bright, the way eyes get when something is landing. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you were here before I ever knew about it. Because Warren worked that ground and it should have stayed with his family. Because Reese's office let the paperwork lapse when Warren died and you shouldn't be paying for their mistake. Because." She said, "That's not all of it." I said, "No." She looked back at the paper. She said, "I can't take this." I said, "Yes, you can." She said, "Ellis." First time she'd used my name. I'd given it to her in November and she hadn't used it once in 6 weeks, had just spoken directly to me without using it. And now she said it and it landed differently than I expected. Being called by your name by someone who means you specifically, not a man standing in front of them, not a neighbor, not a situation they're managing, but you, the particular weight of that. I had not felt it in 4 years. I said, "Keep it. Whatever else happens between us, that paper holds. If you decide come spring you want to leave here and never see me again, that deed is still yours. The land is yours regardless of everything else." She was quiet. The horse shifted behind her and she let its foot down without looking at it. She straightened up slowly. She folded the paper with careful hands and tucked it in her coat pocket. Then she looked at me. She said, "You came back every other day through the worst winter I've seen to bring a woman you didn't know wood and food and fix her roof." I said, "Yes." She said, "And now you're giving her the land under her feet." I said, "Yes." She said, "What kind of man does that?" I said, "The kind that was in the neighborhood." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief and real, nothing performed about it. Then she looked at me directly, her chin up a little, the way she faced into things she'd decided to face all the way. She said, "I see you, Ellis Hart. I want you to know that. I see what you are. I have been alive 62 years. I am not a man who gets stopped cold by words. I have been knocked flat by circumstances and loss and the grinding weight of ordinary years, but words rarely stop me. I do not move fast on the inside in the usual way." She stopped me. Not the land, not any of the wood or the food or the boots or any of it. The fact that she said it plain, "I see what you are." Like it was something she had looked at carefully, taken the full measure of the hard parts and the steady parts both, and decided was worth naming out loud. Like the looking itself had been worth her time. Like what she found at the end of the looking was something she was willing to claim. I put my hand out. She put hers in it. Cold and rough and small, and she gripped hard, the way a person grips something when they mean every bit of what they're doing with their body. We stood like that in the linta with the snow blowing in through the open door, and the horse shifting behind us and the cold coming down the ridge. And there was nothing I needed to say that the grip of a hand didn't already cover better than words would have. Spring came up the ridge in late March, the way it always does up there, not all at once but in pieces. A south-facing slope clearing here, the creek breaking open there, mud appearing in the track one morning like a decision someone had made while you weren't paying attention. By April the garden plot was showing dirt and Nora had her string line and stakes already laid out. I watched her from horseback one morning coming up from the east pasture. She was on her knees running a string line between 2 posts, getting it level, pressing the tension out of it with her thumb. She looked up over her shoulder. She said, "Stop watching me like I'm going to do it wrong." I said, "I'm not watching like that. I genuinely don't know the first thing about a kitchen garden." She said, "Then get down here and I'll show you." I got down. I tied Cutter to the lean-to post and went over, and she taught me how to read the slope for drainage, how to mark out the rows for the sun, how deep to work the soil before you put anything in it. I had been running cattle on this ground for 15 years, and I knew nothing about what she was showing me. She taught it the same way she did everything: straight, no performance, just the plain practical knowledge of someone who'd grown up doing it and understood it from the ground up. We worked for 2 hours, and I came away with dirt on my knees and more real understanding of that quarter-acre than I'd ever had of the rest of the valley. The garden came in well. Better than I would have expected for ground that had been under snow cover for 5 months and then worked for the first time. She knew what she was doing, knew what the soil wanted, when to plant what, how to read the late frosts that still came in May up on the ridge. By June, she had beans coming up and potato sets in, and a row of something she'd grown from seed in the south window of the cabin starting to show through. I helped with it and kept quiet about what I didn't know and learned. That is about all a man can do with a skill he doesn't have and someone who has it standing right next to him. I learned the names of things. I learned why you don't rush certain kinds of work. I learned that the garden had its own schedule, and the schedule didn't care about mine, which was maybe the most useful thing I'd understood about the property in 15 years of owning it. We talked about the land that spring in a different way than we had in the winter. In the winter, we talked around it, around the legal situation, around what it meant that I owned it and she was on it, around the question that neither of us had named directly but both understood was sitting in the room. Now the deed was settled and the question was answered, and we could talk about the land itself, what it was, what it might be. She had ideas, good ones. The east slope where Warren had worked his placer claim was no longer productive. She'd looked it over in April and told me plainly that whatever gold had been there was played out. But the timber on that slope was sound, better than I'd realized, and there was a draw that ran water year-round that she'd found in March, which I had not known about. She had been taking note of things all winter, even in the worst of it. Even when she was down to boiling water and cloth on her feet, she had been watching the land and thinking about what it was and what it might do. That was the kind of mind she had, practical and forward-looking and not given to waste, including the waste of a bad situation. She had spent that hard winter learning the ground she was on. You don't stop looking just because the circumstances are hard. You keep your eyes open, you keep thinking, you keep accounting for what's real. That was Nora. I told Dade about her ideas for the east slope in May. Dade listened, asked 2 good questions, and said it sounded like good thinking. He didn't say anything about where the ideas had come from. He didn't need to. We married in June. Quiet ceremony at the county courthouse in Durango, the county judge officiating, Reese as one witness and Fosco as the other. Fosco had driven us down in the wagon wearing his best hat, and during the proceeding he nodded several times with an air of serious personal approval, which from Fosco was the equivalent of a lengthy and heartfelt speech. Nora wore a blue cotton dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd had in her trunk since Missouri. She looked like herself in it. That is the best I know how to say about how anyone looks in anything. We rode back up to the valley that evening and ate supper at the table in what was now, by every instrument of law and record, her cabin on her land. Also by arrangement the East Line camp of the Hart operation, which gave her the formal standing that the deed had already given her in fact. She accepted both without fuss, in her way, which was to look at things as they were and not make them more or less. After supper, she sat across from me with her coffee and said, "You know the whole valley thinks you've gone soft in the head." I said they thought that before. She said, "Now they have evidence." I said, "Do you think I have?" She looked at me over her cup. Her eyes were warm the way they were sometimes, not often but sometimes, and always real when they were. She was not a person who smiled easily, and when she did it was a particular thing, not wide, not for anyone to see, just the corners of her mouth and something that opened behind her eyes, something that was there for me and not for anyone else. She was smiling now. She said, "I think you found it, finally." I looked at her across the table in the lamplight with the window showing black outside and the creek audible somewhere below us in the dark, running hard with the late snowmelt, talking to itself the way it did when there was a lot of water coming down. I thought about the first night, the doorway and the dark outside it and the bread in both my hands and the cold at my back, and her face in the gap of the door, not afraid. I thought about all the mornings on the ridge through the winter, riding up in the snow with horses loaded, stacking wood while she carried things inside. I thought about her voice in the lean-to in December, "I see what you are," and the particular weight those 5 words had carried and still carried, and I suspected would always carry. I had been a man alone in a large house for 4 years, running a successful operation, keeping everything moving, doing all the work that needed doing. And I had been good at it, and it had meant less every year, and I had not let myself think too hard about why. You get practical. You get narrow. You tell yourself the work is enough and the silence is manageable, and you believe it right up until the moment someone looks at you, really looks, with full knowledge of everything you are, and decides that what they see is worth staying for. She had nothing when she handed me that bread. Down to cloth on her feet and a pot of boiling water and 1 loaf, and she held it out without a moment's hesitation because that was who she was, the kind of person who gives what they have without measuring the cost to themselves. You cannot manufacture a person like that. You either meet one in your life or you don't. I was a man who had given up expecting much from the world, and the world put her in my path in a snowstorm in November. And I had been too cold and too hungry and too far gone to do anything but receive it. She got up to fill the coffee. On her way back she put her hand on my shoulder, just rested it there a moment as she passed, warm and steady, no ceremony about it, and then she sat back down and we finished the evening in the good quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight but no edge, the kind that fills a house when the people in it mean to be there. The creek ran on below us in the dark. The lamp burned low. Outside the window, the valley lay under a clear sky, 12,000 acres and 1 parcel of it hers by deed, and all of it shared now in every way that mattered. I remember the ride back down the ridge after the day in December when I gave her the deed. The light was going out of the sky fast the way it does in winter, the valley filling up with dark from the bottom while the ridge stayed pale above it. I rode slow. Cutter had learned by then that I wasn't going to push him in the dark, and he walked easy, picking his own line through the snow. I thought about my father, which I don't do often. He had been a rancher too, a small one, scratching at ground in Kansas that didn't want to be scratched. He'd told me once, when I was young and impatient about something, I don't even remember what, that the things that last are the things you build slow. That patience is not the same as weakness. That a man who knows what he has and holds on to it without making noise about it is worth more than one who shouts about it from horseback. I had been holding on to nothing for 4 years, going through the motions of a man who had things, running land I'd stopped seeing, working a life I'd stopped feeling the point of, and then a storm and a lame horse and a woman who handed a stranger everything she had left and did it without flinching. The valley was black below me by the time I reached the main house. The lamp in the bunkhouse window, smoke from the kitchen chimney, the familiar sounds of the place settling into night. I put Cutter up and went inside and sat for a while at the kitchen table in the dark, and I thought, you came close to letting all of it go. You came close to living out the rest of your years, in the motions of a life without the life in it. And then the world put her in your path. Pay attention to that. Hold on to it. Don't let it get small on you the way the rest of it got small. I didn't let it get small. I had owned most of Bone Creek Valley for 15 years, and I had never known what it was for until that night. Now I did. That was more than enough.